Okay,
hi everyone, this is Dr. Okay.
Sorry.
Hi everyone, this is Dr. Victoria Nalule, and here with me is Hilary Bell. So in today's webinar, this is our first webinar with respect to the book project that we're editing on international arbitration in the African energy and mineral sector. But before I even tell you more about the series, the webinar series, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Hilary Bell. So I would like her to briefly introduce herself and also briefly tell us about the book project she's working on, but I'll just like to share a poster with you. So the book project is focused on, her book chapter is on managing region Pacific risk to minimize energy infrastructure disputes. And in today's webinar, she's going to take us through some key issues with respect to her findings, her research on that specific book project or book chapter. So before we start, I would like Hilary to briefly introduce herself, tell us about her professional experience, profession background, her areas of expertise within energy or arbitration, and the previous work she has been doing, and where exactly she's based right now, including the country, but also the institution she's working with. So Hilary, you have all the time to introduce yourself and sell your CV to our viewers.
Thank you, Victoria. I'm trying to remember the answers to all of those questions. I'm originally a litigator from the United Kingdom. None of you will miss my accent. I'm from Scotland. I was a practice court lawyer in Scotland and I moved to Qatar 9 years ago. I'm currently a professor at Hamad bin Khalifa University in Qatar. I've been here for 4 years. I previously taught at Qatar University and practiced in construction law in Qatar with an international law firm. My research areas are construction law, particular to the energy in the energy sector. I've recently got a book chapter coming out next year on EPC contracts, specifically in the energy sector. I am a fellow of the Chartered Institute of Arbitrators, so arbitration is also a key interest of my research, as is how we learn and how we can improve the teaching of law at university level. To this end, I coach teams every year in the Viz International Commercial Arbitration MOOC competition, giving them a full experience of running an arbitration dispute through to the hearing. Inshallah, this year we'll be back in Vienna, failing which we'll be still online. The world has changed. That's my background. Do you want to say a bit more about the book before I talk about my specific chapter?
Yes. So this is a book project edited by myself, Dr. Victoria Nalule, and Professor Damilola Olawinyi. And the book project, it will be a live book project whereby you should expect to see chapters as soon as possible. And we're expecting more than 50 chapters. So for the attendees, be assured that we'll be hosting over 50 videos on dispute resolution with respect to the energy and mining sector. So keep an eye on the NEM website for the upcoming webinars. We also have a webinar tomorrow at 1:30 p.m. UK time. So keep an eye on all the webinars that will be coming up. So Professor Hilary, I'll talk about your chapter, which is mainly managing region-specific risk to minimize energy infrastructure disputes in Africa. Why did you choose this chapter, and what can our viewers learn about the chapter? Because I know the webinar is brief and they'll be able to read your book chapter afterwards, but let them just get a feel of what is included in this chapter.
It seems to me that the infrastructure market in Africa is booming just now. There are lots of projects taking place in the infrastructure market in Africa, notably in mining and energy projects. There are literally, I think, $399 billion spent last year on infrastructure in Africa. I think about 17% of that was on energy infrastructure and about 6% on mining infrastructure. And the construction market is sluggish in other areas. Europe, Asia, the US have all been, the markets in infrastructure have been far harder hit by the COVID-19 pandemic. With the exception of South Africa, African states have really weathered the pandemic quite well. The markets are underway. There's a huge infrastructure deficit in Africa. Only 35% of people have access to electricity, and states are heavily investing in making up this gap. So it looks like energy projects, infrastructure projects over the next, say, 10 years are going to be more and more taking place in Africa. Due to humanitarian logistical issues, the legacy of civil war, political instability, there are not an adequate number of construction and infrastructure personnel in Africa to carry out these projects. And so these are going to involve partnerships with international contractors. The larger part of being a construction lawyer is managing risk or dealing with disputes due to risk that has not been adequately managed. And Africa is going to be the key continent, region in the world for these disputes going forward. And so it seems a really prescient time to look at what risk factors have to be taken into account in the infrastructure market there, because it's going to be big business.
Professor Bell, is that it?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Well, that on why the chapter, yes. I mean, I can continue and tell you my main findings regarding risk, but on average, projects in Africa range between $50 million and $500 million. These are large projects that are taking place, and so the stakes are very high for the state entities that are sponsoring the work and for the international contractors that are undertaking the work. It's a challenging environment. In the past, economic volatility, political instability, and the environmental challenges, of working in Africa put off international contractors from taking work there. But direct foreign investment, improved physical and digital infrastructure are encouraging international parties to go there. The Belt and Road Initiative globally has seen Chinese state-owned enterprises really dominate construction markets, and Africa is no exception to this. The majority of projects in Africa are state funded, but 30% of the works being undertaken are being undertaken by Chinese contractors, and they represent the second highest source of project debt in Africa. Commodity prices have boomed following the COVID-19 pandemic, and we're seeing commodities, gold, iron ore, really booming, and this has resulted in renewed interest in exploring greenfield and brownfield sites in Africa. While there was a 10% dip in exploration last year, there was still $1 billion invested in exploration in Africa. And while infrastructure activities were slightly impacted, the pressing drive to bridge this infrastructure gap has kept works largely underway in Africa. Yes, there were some short-term shutdowns. There have been delays due to new site procedures that have taken place to stem the spread of COVID-19. But overall, the construction industry in Africa is thriving. Region-specific risk. This is the key focus of the chapter. That's why it's really important for us to look at this. But the risk in African projects is slightly different from those in other regions, and entrants to the market could be taken by surprise by the change in risk. And to secure project success and avoid project failure, it's important that this risk is managed. The top reason for claims and disputes is the same as it is in other regions, and that would be change in scope, late design, late approvals, incomplete design. These things we're all familiar with in the construction world. But there are unique local conditions that are there are unique local conditions in Africa that must be taken account of to avoid project failure or extreme losses. And those are the supply chain issues, local content requirements, and the challenges securing payment in the African market. Lack of competent supply chains is in part due to the lack of infrastructure on the continent. Sourcing materials, quite often construction materials required, are simply not available or not available at the level of quality required by the project. Therefore, the time and cost obtaining these building materials exceeds expectations, and this will can account for up to 80% scheduling issues in a project. Suppliers locally are not ready for the scale and demands of projects. As I said, the average project is between 50 and 500 million US dollars, and sometimes the scale of these projects is part of the challenge. If contractors do not take account of the reality of supply chains, they're likely to underestimate this when pricing the works, programming the works, and when designing their procurement strategy. If projects are done on a lump sum basis and this is underestimated, project failure is almost certain. What contractors can't do when they come to Africa is base their experience off their experience in other jurisdictions. And that's true for within the continent as well. One host state is very different to another state. There are more than 50 jurisdictions in Africa, and it's not a level playing field. You can't assume because you've had an operation in one country that there will be a similar experience in the other. It's not the case. There are gross disparities across the region. Many African states subscribe to local content requirements, requiring infrastructure projects to utilise local resources, labour forces and suppliers. And we're seeing an uptick in disputes where these prerequisites are now being enforced. Infrastructure developers are being taken to court for failure to comply, and contractors have to be aware of this change in dynamic. Illegality follows from breach of local content requirements, but this can also void the contracts with local suppliers and local entities. So complying with these requirements is essential. And also the spirit of these regulations is to improve expertise in the region, and contractors would do well to enter into the spirit of these requirements rather than just avoiding fines. Let's actually develop expertise in the region, because that will help projects going forward. With regard to securing payment, as with construction anywhere, ongoing finance is the cornerstone of properly administered construction works. Profit margins in projects in Africa go as low as 5%, roughly between 5 and 10%. And if the collapse of Carillion taught us anything, it's that working on low profit margins is very dangerous. Collapse can happen, and securing timely, regular payments throughout the life cycle of the works is essential. Africa is reportedly a decade behind more developed countries when it comes to administering payment claims and disputes. Contractors have to take that into account. There are a lot of bureaucratic processes. A lot of these projects are being funded by state entities that have a very high level of audit scrutiny. A lot of evidence is required, different to practices in other countries. A higher level of evidentiary scrutiny is required. So contractors need to find out right up front what they're going to require to substantiate payment claims, because very often they're not aware of this and huge delays and backlogs are occurring. Contractors have to find out right up front what is the degree of audit scrutiny, and then they will quite simply have to change their practices when it comes to capturing and managing data and documents. They need to do that throughout the life cycle of the works, particularly because there's always a chance that there will be disputes towards the end of the project. And given the nature of construction works, very often the main parties who have access to the required evidence are no longer part of the project when disputes arise. This is something that parties have to take into account. My recommendation would be to get a legal team in as the project's winding down, to identify any gaps in the data needed to substantiate claims and get that in a systematically stored manner, so it can be accessed later if needs be. Contractors must stay on top of payment claims, know their entitlements to suspend and terminate the contract, because there is a lack of liquid funding in many African states, because these projects are being funded from the profits of commodities. And commodity price volatility is a real issue if the state is dependent on income from one commodity and its value drops. There may not be funding available to pay for the construction works. So contractors need to make sure their payments stay up to date. Also, they need to be aware that any price overruns, there may not be money in the budget for that. Some African states are reliant on oil and gas, cobalt, copper, iron ore, lithium. And given the duration of an infrastructure project, there's huge scope for volatility in the income from these resources during the life cycle of the works. Inflation is also an issue in Africa. The states are particularly vulnerable to inflation due to changes in government policy, legislation, changes in the exchange rate, changes in commodity prices. Building materials can account for between 50 to 60% of project costs. One reported case of inflation going up by 37% in a project in Nigeria. Now, with the 37% inflation, any lump sum project is going to fail. There's no way cost rises on that scale can be absorbed, particularly if profit margins have been set between 5 and 10%. Competing interests lie at the heart of infrastructure projects, and so disputes are almost inevitable. Energy infrastructure projects, mining infrastructure projects are notoriously litigious, and parties must ensure that they have sound access to justice. If they're going to pursue a claim, to make sure that the rule of law is well respected in the state where that dispute will be heard. Make sure that they're able to resist any spurious claims and that they will be able to enforce any awards that are made in their favour. Energy and mining infrastructure disputes are rising in Africa. Litigation funders are reporting a real uptick from state-owned enterprises pursuing infrastructure disputes. Also, the first dispute has recently been instituted by a Chinese mainland state-owned entity. So the first dispute raised by a Chinese state-owned entity against an African state has recently been reported, coming in at $50 million against Ghana. Now, this is the first time formal dispute resolution proceedings have been instituted, and given the impact or the involvement of the Chinese contractors in the African market, this could open the floodgates. It's an interesting time for dispute resolution to see how this is going to go. Across the more than 50 jurisdictions, there are huge disparities with regard to the respect for the rule of law. It's not a level playing field, and some states do recognise and respect the rule of law more than others. Due diligence is required by contractors to be sure what their likelihood is of parallel proceedings if they institute an arbitral proceedings against a state-owned entity. What's the likely treatment of the local courts? Will they resist parallel proceedings? How will they fare in those proceedings? How can they enforce their award? There's a real trend for domestic arbitration taking the fore in Africa just now. There's been a lot of suspicion around international arbitration spoken about in the continent, particularly the high costs associated with institutional arbitration. I think it's $5,000 just now to start a claim at the ICC, but the Nairobi Dispute Settlement Centre can offer it for $200 to start your claim. And litigation funders are more confident now. They're expressing that they are confident to fund commercial arbitrations, domestic arbitrations in Africa. So this is likely to be a big trend going forward. State-owned enterprises have the bargaining power when it comes to setting up the dispute resolution forum. So it will be interesting to see how this goes forward. Right now, in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, negotiated settlements are on the rise. Contractors are aware of a sluggish market and ready to accept settlements, and employers particularly state entities are happy to progress the works rather than get embroiled in dispute resolution. Prior to engagement in any construction project in Africa, people have to be pragmatic and do due diligence. To summarise, contractors new to the region must take account of project risk and actively manage that risk. When they're pricing and programming the work, fully investigate the abilities of the local supply chains, take into account inflation and the risk of late payments and project failure while completing the works, comply with environmental laws. Recently, there's a trend in African state-owned entities avoiding arbitration on the grounds of illegality because they can demonstrate that there have been breaches of environmental laws during the progress of the construction works. And as a result, arbitral tribunals have no jurisdiction because of that illegality. Data management is essential. The normal haphazard way of managing a construction project has to change in frontier markets. This is more true than ever. Finally, ensure that will be respected if that's the forum that the parties choose, and know the local court regime, and if possible, pursue a negotiated settlement if that's possible. So we have a few questions, and one of them is in respect of, the growing trend of Chinese monopoly. I think 30% is going a bit far to say a monopoly, but dominance certainly, but that's not just true of African projects. I would say that, with the Belt and Road Initiative, we have seen, Chinese dominance across regions because they are pursuing that actively. They have access to project debt, so they're able to fund projects. Also, a lot of Chinese contractors are taking on huge amounts of risk because they have the access to this project funding, and they are taking on mining projects that other parties would find perhaps too risky. So I've made a conclusive contention regarding profit margins. I think profit margins go as high as 25%, but the report is there seem to be a lot of project profits taken on at very low levels to secure a foothold in the region. And we've seen this in other regions. We've seen problems with contractors thinking, this is, I'm in the Middle East, I'm in Qatar. I don't know if I said that at the beginning, but certainly, over the last 10 years, a lot of contractors came to the Middle East, not Qatar specifically, but Qatar included, and took on projects at very low profit margins and did not succeed and had to be replaced because they weren't able to get the works done because they hadn't adequately priced the works, taking account of regional risk. Let's see. So, Victoria, are you back on with us? I hope I've answered your questions.
Yes, I'm back. I'm back on. I saw a question. Have you addressed it? The question from Ivan?
I think I've addressed all three of them.
Maybe I can read it for you.
No, I think
he's
I've
asking what measure you've addressed that, right?
So maximise sustainable project financing while minimising debt burden on foreign dependence. Well, it depends where the funding's coming from. If the funding's coming from the state, they have to perhaps look at how the milestones are being done. If the funding can be secured up front, I think it's challenging if funding is based on anticipated profits or volatility. It is known about. The best indicator of future performance is past performance, and we know that commodities are a volatile source of income. So it's likely that project debt will continue to be accepted from, for example, Chinese contractors. So sustainability is a tricky one. It depends if they are securing financing upfront or not.
All right, thanks a lot, Hilary. And I do apologize, my network is really bad, but I don't think we have any more questions. So I'd like you to give the concluding remarks with respect to dispute resolution, especially in energy infrastructure. What do you think should be the way forward for African governments and policymakers in tackling that issue of dispute resolution, but also the relevant stakeholders, including the companies? What would be your concluding remarks and conclusion?
I would say that the market is almost self-regulating in this way. We are seeing a shift towards domestic arbitration, and I think that will settle a lot of the issues around suspicion of international arbitration. Huge suspicions have grown up of prejudice, the lack of representation of African arbitrators, despite the overrepresentation of African disputes. African arbitrators are not adequately represented at an international level. And as we're seeing, the trends in infrastructure projects are for the employers to push for, and they have the bargaining power to secure domestic arbitration. There are a lot of excellent, credible forums in Africa that are demonstrating themselves to be the ideal place to resolve disputes. And this should secure buy-in at government level, because if there's a suspicion of bias against African parties at an international level, domestic arbitration succeeding should alleviate these concerns. And these are viable institutions with good track records. And I think international contractors will also buy into this, because the proof is in the pudding. These centres are coming out with good objective results.
All right, thank you, Hilary. I think we've got another question still from Ivan. He's saying, Hilary, would you say that African judicial institutions have exhibited a trend of willingness to recognize and enforce arbitral awards, or you observe a trend of unwillingness to do so by national courts? I think the question is more about enforcement of the arbitral awards.
Yeah, it's hard to say as well, because there's such disparity. Awards are being enforced. There are certain countries that are really showing commitment to this. Egypt, Nigeria are showing great respect for the rule of law, particularly with regards to arbitration. Other countries, for example, Tanzania recently refused to enforce an arbitral award. Canada responded by seizing an airplane, and ultimately the award was satisfied, but extreme measures were called into question. Resource nationalism is a reality in many African states at the moment, and there has been a real pushback against having arbitration as the settlement, or as a dispute resolution forum. But it's not a level playing field. Certain countries are showing, recommitting, showing real commitment. It's hard to say. Angola, Nigeria, Egypt, and Morocco, very strong pro-arbitration countries and are consistent in demonstrating that. But Tanzania, Mali, Sierra Leone, less so. And this is the point that contractors coming to Africa can't generalize. We talk about Africa as if it's a homogeneous region. It's not. It's vast disparities. We're talking about 54, 56 different legal jurisdictions. There are trends that we can discuss, lessons learned, but it's hard to generalize about such a disparate group of states.
All right, thank you very much, Hilary. So I don't think we have any more questions, and this marks the end of our webinar. This was a very short webinar, but be sure to get the book chapter on Professor Hilary Bell's book contribution, which deals with infrastructure, energy disputes in Africa. So I'll keep updating you. I'm sure I have all your email addresses. So don't forget to share the YouTube link with your colleagues, your contacts. And if you have any questions addressed to Professor Hilary Bell, you can reach her on LinkedIn and also Twitter and all other social media network. Thank you very much, everyone. And thank you very much, Professor Bell, for the brilliant presentation. And I do apologize for the network problems, but I'm sure perhaps on YouTube, it will be showing very well. So this marks the end of our webinar. See you tomorrow at 1:30 UK time. So for the other people who are interested in more webinars in energy and mining dispute resolution or arbitration, this whole month and October, we're going to be hosting different experts from different countries who'll be discussing their book chapters. So be sure to check out the website of NIM Energy, as I indicated in the emails I sent you, and also share with your colleagues who are interested in international arbitration. Have a lovely day and take care. This marks the end of the webinar. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Victoria.
Thank you.